Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about note-taking. Note-taking is one of those weird subjects that people have mixed feelings about. And it depends on what it is you're doing, what it is you're learning. You may be wanting to take notes in your chemistry class, in, AP chemistry in high school, or you're taking, maybe graduate level courses that require you to memorize a ton of information, or you may be at home learning how to develop video games. And it's been my experience that depending on the subject that you're studying, the likelihood that you will see someone taking notes, it varies greatly. It varies very greatly depending on the subject matter. So I'm gonna give you basically my opinion about note taking and how actually I think it's very crucial, very important if you are that type of learner to take notes. Now, not to get too scientific about the brain and human cognition, but there have been studies that show that taking notes does assist in the learning process. Now, there are some misconceptions when it comes to taking notes. One misconception is that you're going to pull those notes out and use them later, and that's the only reason to do it. People do take their notes out and use them later on for various reasons, but not always. And so the question becomes, if I am not going to pull my notes back out and read them a second time, was writing them down a waste of time? And the answer is absolutely not. When you write down, and particularly with a writing utensil in your physical hand, rather than typing notes out into an app like a word processor or maybe a note-taking app, the studies have shown that when you take a pencil or a pen and you write out what it is you're trying to learn, it's somehow burned into your memory more solidly. It's definitely been shown, there's been statistical significance that writing it down solidifies that knowledge in your brain. And so really it doesn't matter if you ever take those notes back out and read them again, it's actually burned more solidly into your brain just by writing them down. And I think my personal opinion about the writing down process of your notes is, and this could be wrong, but this is what, in my experience, what I feel is the case. When you write things down with a physical pencil, it often takes longer than it would to type them out on a keyboard. And when you're typing them out on a keyboard, you're almost typing them at the same speed that you would read. I mean, it depends on how fast you can type, but you're typing much faster than you could write with a pencil or a pen for sure. And when you write down things with a pencil or a pen, as long as you're not, scribbling things at an insanely fast rate, you're forced to slow down and you're looking at the concepts, you're looking at the sentences that you're writing, and you're slowing down and you're sort of processing it at a different speed than if you were to gloss over it or listen to an instructor say it to you in a class. And so when you write things down, the fact that you're slowing your brain down and focusing on a particular idea, it's sort of, and I don't know if this is a subconscious action, but it sort of, forces your brain to process it a little more thoroughly. At least that's my opinion. So definitely the evidence is there that taking notes can benefit you. Now, the question is, when do you take notes and for what subjects? Because some subject matter clearly doesn't require note taking because you're listening to it like a documentary and you get the gist of it. There aren't very many facts that you have to recall via rote memory. But those types of subjects are typically ones that are not very difficult to learn in the first place, right? And again, that's my opinion. So I have an engineering degree, and when I was in college for engineering, very quickly I found that I was going to need to take some notes because for certain courses, there was a huge amount of information, very specific information, not general ideas, but specific facts that I would have to recall later on. Things like math formulas, things like chemical reactions and very specific things like that, and I had to take notes for those. And so in my experience, specific facts, and particularly a large number of them, do require to some extent note taking. Now, what does this have to do with things like game development, programming, things like that? Do you need to take notes for that kind of stuff? And the answer is yes and no. When it comes to things like programming, you learn so much that it's almost impossible to take notes. It's almost more useful to just have reference material, things like books and things like that, pocket books. The whatever programming language you're using at the time, there's most likely a pocketbook reference for that with the main core, ideas of that programming language, the fundamentals of it. And of course, I recommend buying the pocketbook for the language you're using. They're extremely useful. It's almost impossible to take notes when you're programming, but that for a programming language in general, because it's almost like learning a language. It really is learning a language, but learning a speaking language such as English or Spanish or Japanese. You're not going to really sit down and write down every word because there's like 10,000 plus, maybe even 10 times that, depending on the language, of words, and you can't really write them all down. You'll spend years and years writing them all down. It's faster just to learn them. So, learning things like a programming language, I personally haven't taken very many notes. I've actually tried to take notes when learning C++, and I ended up just kind of giving that up and learning it more like a language. You read lines of code, and you kind of, if you treat it like a language, it's more like reading a line of Spanish or reading a line of English. It's just kind of a natural thing. Now, when video game programming, in particular in Unreal Engine, which is the engine I use, if you're a C++ programmer in Unreal Engine, you're going to start learning very specific facts, things that have to do with the Unreal Engine API. There are libraries in Unreal Engine filled with all of these functions and classes, things that are pre-written for you that you're going to take advantage of so you don't reinvent the wheel. Things like, if you have an object in your scene, in your game, typically called an actor, because all things that you put into your level in an Unreal Engine game are at least derived from the actor class. And there are all these different functions for actors, such as get actor location and things like that. These are things that are specific and have specific syntax rules that, if there isn't a book already out there that tells you the details of the syntax, or an online resource, taking notes can become very useful. And for that reason, I've created something for myself that I refer to as my own personal tome of secrets. These are things, and they shouldn't be secret, they should be out there on the internet, but these are things that I haven't found on the internet through documentation, forums, things like that, or things that have been found on the internet, but there is no one source collaborating, or I guess taking all of them into one big document. I haven't really found something like that. The closest thing to that would be the Unreal Engine documentation, which gives you some information, but not all of the information regarding something, or personal experiences relating to that. So I have a tome of secrets, and it's basically this big, huge binder here. It's a binder with a bunch of sections in it. I use engineering paper, but there's nothing, especially special about engineering paper other than the fact that it happens to be green. I don't know if that's a tradition, but it happens to be green. It's a little more expensive. It has grid, green grid on the back, which is not very good for writing things down. Typically, you write on the front where the grid is still visible. It helps to give you a sort of, gives you rectilinear lines to use as reference. And so, I just happen to have a whole crap ton of it from engineering school, so I'm using it. But my Tome of Secrets has been invaluable to me. It has been absolutely useful, because there are things that I find myself needing to go back and look up over and over again. And with this by my side, I basically can just look it up. For example, C++ and Unreal Engine, I created my first third-person character, and that entailed a lot. It entailed, movement inputs. It entailed variables, things that have to do with game mechanics, like health, like stamina, things like that. And there was a lot of details involved with that, and it was something that you don't really want to rely on your memory when it comes to learning that type of stuff. It's just, there's too much of it. And so I've actually gone as far as getting different colors of pens and writing writing in my engineering paper the code for, a third-person character. So here's a basic third-person character. I've got the U property macros in there. I've got the different colors. You've got the comments in there. And so I've basically got this document here that I've created for myself that I can pull out whenever I want to make a third-person character in Unreal Engine using C++. And so, you could even easily do this with blueprints or for any other thing. And I've got this, here's the H file, which has all the declarations of the variables and functions. And then after I wrote that down, I've got the notes on the H file. So I've got all of these things, little notes explaining each thing and what it's there for, what it does. And actually going through this has made me learn more than if I had just looked up how to do something and done it. When you write notes down about a particular subject, you are forced to explain it as if you're explaining it to someone who doesn't know. And when you're explaining it, even to an imaginary person or just for yourself in your notes, it is a very enlightening experience. It forces you to explain it like you understand it. And sometimes it's a rude awakening. It makes you realize, well, I guess I don't fully understand this because I can't really explain it that well. So that's kind of a learning technique, in my opinion, is, when you're writing these down and explaining things in your own words, you're forcing yourself, you're realizing, well, I guess I didn't really understand it, but forcing yourself to do so makes you understand it. It brings you to that level of understanding to where now you can explain it to someone. And that's, one of the reasons why I do tutorial videos is because it solidifies the information for me. I've done tutoring, I've done teaching, and when you teach something, you solidify that subject matter for yourself. And when someone asks you a question and you're put on the spot and you're forced to answer it, well then, that's the moment of truth. Do you understand it well enough to explain it? And if not, you're going to look like you don't know what you're talking about. And if you do, well, then you show yourself that you know what you're doing. And so you don't have to do things my way, but if you're interested, what I do is I have things tabbed out. So here's, blueprints, animations, artist work, other software. This is the C++ section. And really I have every little subject tabbed up. So if I want to say, add a component to an actor, I have a little tab that says adding components here, and I just flip to it, and not only does it have the code, but it has notes and things like, what this code does. And it actually has, I wrote out an actual example. So I have things like enums, force and torque, get mouse position, enable UMG, multiplayer. All this stuff is basically things I've learned that I don't want to forget, because I've found that things like game development or any really complicated subject, it involves learning a lot. And when you move from, say, creating a third-person character to creating enemies and doing enemy AI, you're going to spend so much time on that enemy AI that by the time you're done with that, you've forgotten all about how to create a third-person character. And so, coming back to your Tome of Secrets, when you want to create a new game with a new third-person character, just flip to that, and it all comes back to you because you wrote it down yourself. So it's extremely useful. And when I take things like Udemy courses, like I'll purchase a Udemy course on a subject, and I have a notebook ready for that course. For example, if I take a course on Unreal Engine multiplayer, I will get a notebook, and I'm a sucker for notebooks. I like to go look at different notebooks, and I'll just buy them because I like them. It's kind of a shopping addiction. But I'll buy notebooks that look really nice. This one is like engineering paper, but it's got dots on it instead of graph. And basically this was what I used for a Udemy course, and I filled it up with all these interesting notes that tell you in little diagrams and things that tell you how the instructor explained it, and when I tried it, if it worked or didn't work, I wrote how to make it work. And things like that. So you'll notice I have different color ink. I've noticed that using different color ink to separate, blue for the highlights or whatever color you want, for making things stand out. It's not really. I mean, it helps when you go back and look at it again, sure, but also it helps it stand out in your mind a little better. So if you have, a particular, you outline a section, right? This section is for actor overlap, and you put actor overlap in blue with underlining and the rest is black, but then the important parts you use other colors to make it stand out. That makes it stand out in your mind, in your memory. And so when you're thinking about it later on, I think there's a subconscious element to it. You basically, you remember those points more solidly. It's like when you're taking a course in college or in school and you have a textbook, almost always the most important terms in your textbook will be in bold or italic. I look for bold and italic words in textbooks all the time. And when I'm taking my notes, I write those in bold. Or I write the bold ones in a different color is what I do. It's because it's kind of hard to write in bold. But, and it takes a little extra time switching pens, but, you get good at it. So I have a notebook for basically every subject I've written. I have tubs of notebooks from college, and I keep them in storage because sometimes I want to just bust them out and look at what I learned and what I've forgotten. And so, look for different types of notebooks, things that work good for you. This is actually one that I used for when I started planning my C++ for Unreal Engine course tutorial series, and I've got these interesting notes of things that I didn't want to forget, and every once in a while I'll just look through them and look at different things and be like, oh yeah, I forgot that topic, I need to put that into a tutorial video and things like that. And so it's extremely useful. And when I not only when I'm learning something do I take notes, but when I'm creating something, I make notes as well. So this is a very valuable notebook to me. It's used while I create basically my video game. My video game is very procedurally generated. It's heavy on the procedural generation. And because there isn't much procedural generation literature out there, there's some, but not a lot, for the things that I wanted to do, no one really has ever come out with articles on how to do it. Not exactly how I wanted to. My random dungeon generator is all unique technology that I've developed, all unique software and algorithms that I've created using my knowledge of algorithms and programming. And it was extremely difficult to just think about and create. In fact, it was pretty much impossible for me. What I had to do was write my thoughts out as I was thinking them. Like, okay, I wanted to be able to do a particular thing, so I would write it out, and then my algorithms, some of the algorithms I would write pseudocode or straight up actual C++ code in my my notebook, and these are ideas that basically I wanted to come to fruition in my code, but it would have been impossible without actually writing them out first. So when you're creating things, when you're developing a video game, when you're developing an app, when you're developing something, it helps to write out your ideas, and it structures them. It forces you to put them in structure, and also it puts them onto a piece of physical paper that will not just evaporate from your memory later on. And memories tend to do that. And I like to draw diagrams and things. Like, I'm big on graph data structures, and so I've got data structures that have references to each other and things. Like in graph theory, it helps to draw that out. It helps to actually put it on a piece of paper, and then you have this document, this thing that's it shows you not only how you created that, how you went through the creation process, but also it helps you to have something to come back to when you go to other projects and come back and you can't quite remember. So documentation and comments in your code only goes so far, but having an actual document like this, it can go a long way. And finally, I have some documents where I've basically done the same thing as my other notebooks, but much more thorough. This is actually the start of a project where I'm taking basically all the code in my video game, and there's tens of thousands of lines of code, and taking the main ones and putting those core algorithms in this book. This is a very, very valuable thing, because if you want to recreate something, it helps to have documentation. And for something like that, you don't necessarily need to write it by hand, because there's a lot of it, but it helps to have a document package, especially with big things like games. And diagrams help. That's why I like dotted paper and I like graph paper, because diagrams for things like here's a diagram of a Xbox controller and what each button will do in the game. And so I created this first, and then I coded it in C++ and Unreal Engine, and I had this to look back on. And of course things can change and be adjusted, but it's like I had a game plan to follow rather than just going blind and coding things on the fly. Some people can do it that way. I typically cannot, and I don't claim to have the best way to do things, but it works for me. And so I thought it was important enough to create a vlog about note taking, because it's done wonders for me. I've taken some pretty tough courses in my degree. I did chemical engineering, bachelor's degree, and during that whole experience, there were certain courses that were just so hard. They were awful. They were not even enjoyable. They were so difficult, especially because of the pressure of, some courses were, at my college anyway, they were only offered once a year. And so if you failed that class, and it was a prerequisite to the next big class, so if you failed it, you couldn't get to the next one. You had to wait an entire year to retake it, so you didn't even graduate till a year later. And that was really stressful, especially for classes that were just so difficult that everyone was like, are we even going to pass this class? I had classes that were so difficult, the class average on exams was a failing grade, which is not unusual in engineering. You'd have an average of 30 or 40%. And then with the curve, the instructor would curve it so that the average was something like a B, and people who got a higher than average score would get an A, people who got a lower than average score would get a C, or maybe even a failing grade still, depending on how abysmally bad they did. But it's not that the classroom was stupid. These were bright people. It's just that the subject matter was so hard, and they made the tests way more difficult than something that even a good student could attain, because they wanted to see who could approach the perfect score, who could go above and beyond everyone else. They wanted to see those students, plus they wanted to kind of kill our spirit in a sense, that they wanted to basically show us that, you know, the real world is going to be more like this. You're not going to attain 100% of your goal. You're going to get something like 30%, and you're going to have to deal with it, and you're going to have to adapt. So that was a learning experience. But, you know, what that has to do with taking notes is that notes were my friend during that time. Notes, in my opinion, helped me to remember and solidify material that led to me getting higher than average scores. You know, I was getting A's in classes. I remember there was a class where the class average was about 40% for tests, and I was still approaching A grades even before the curve. And the reason was not because I was like super smart or anything. I'm decently smart, I think, but because I spent hours, extra hours, with the textbook open with these really abstract, difficult concepts, and I was like taking the concepts I didn't understand that well and writing them out and reflecting on them and coming back to them and making sure I understood them. And of course I did other things like watch courses on YouTube, you know, read extra supplemental books, and you know, I went way too beyond what I should have done for those courses, but you know, as a result I did very well in them. But taking notes, I think, solidified that. So, you know, when you're learning things like game development, when you're learning things like, you know, maybe programming languages or whatever, it's a judgment call on your behalf. You may not be the type of person that likes to take notes at all, and I've seen a lot of people just listen to lectures without taking notes, or just read books without taking notes. And for some subjects, they do perfectly well. But for other subjects, I have seen them suffer. And I think that they suffered because they didn't take extra time and effort to do something like take notes. And so it's just been something that, in my opinion, was a crucial missing piece for their educational experience. So if you're considering taking notes, what I recommend is, you know, don't just pick up the cheapest notebook and a regular number 2 pencil that's you have to use a like mechanical sharpener for. I recommend showing your note taking that you're serious. You know, treat your note taking with respect. Buy a nice notebook. Spend more than $10 on a notebook. I know that's kind of a strange piece of advice, and you by all means, if you're, you know, if it's unreasonable for you to shell out that kind of cash, don't do it. But if you can, I recommend getting something nice. It feels nice. It looks nice. It feels good to carry it around and to open it up. And buy multicolored pens. Buy more expensive pens. Don't go crazy. Don't spend $20 on a pen unless you want to. But I like sets of pens with different colors so I can write things that are important in colors that stand out. And also a good pen that will glide with your handwriting, because, you know, if you're going to be taking a lot of notes, your hand is going to get tired, and you want something that glides pretty smoothly. You know, give me a comment or an email if you want my opinion on some good products, but it doesn't matter what the products are, just get something that's good for you, but don't go for the cheapest thing. And here's another thing that, you know, might be easier or harder for you, but more artistic people tend to have an easier time with this. But don't rush through your note taking. Write neatly, write orderly, and try to not scratch out too many things. If you're writing with a pencil, obviously you can erase, but try to make your notes nice and neat. In fact, sometimes I'll take a really, really rough looking page of notes and I'll write it more concisely and more neatly, and it just shows something to your subconscious mind, like this is important enough to take the time to give it the care that it deserves in your mind. You're prioritizing it as important to your mind, and your subconscious mind will work on that, and you will remember that more, because more deeply, more solidly, because you've shown yourself that it's important to you. So that's my opinion on taking notes. Take it with a grain of salt. You may not feel the same way. But I feel strongly enough about it that I think it's important to tell you about my experiences, how it's had an effect on my life, and how it's really helped with my success when learning various subjects. I have understood certain subjects better than I've understood others, and definitely taking notes has had something to do with it. So if you like this video, feel free to like it, subscribe, do whatever you want. If you like it, I appreciate you watching. And comment below. Tell me what works for you when you're learning. Tell me if taking notes in a certain way that's different than mine is working for you. If you have a different way of learning, if you have a different way of thinking about things. I know not all people learn the same way. Some people have difficulties taking notes. Some people have difficulties reading things. There are things like dyslexia that, you look at something and, it could do more harm than good. It could make things more difficult, and you might be more of an audio listener. Maybe you take a recording device in and record lectures and then go back home and listen to them later. Maybe you have a recording device you carry with you and you take notes by speaking into the device. So tell me if you have a different method, a different way of learning, solidifying information and things like that. So I'm very interested in seeing how you guys do it. So as always, thank you for watching. I hope you like this video, and we'll see you in the next video.